So genetic drift, along with natural selection, mutation, and migration, it is one of the basic mechanisms of evolution. In each generation, some individuals may, just by chance, leave behind a few more descendants and genes, of course, than other individuals. The genes of the next generation will be the genes of the lucky individuals, not necessarily the healthier or better equipped individuals in a population. So in a nutshell, that's genetic drift. Just the lucky ones are the ones that end up surviving and therefore passing on their genes to the next generation. It happens to all populations, and there is no avoiding the vagaries of chance. The image that you see represents an individual population, or individuals in a population of marmorated stink bugs. With the stink bugs, there are variation. There are green and there are brown individuals in the population. By random happenstance, somebody squishes a few of the marmorated stink bugs. This causes a situation where some that are left in the population, just by randomness, end up with characteristics that end up in higher frequencies. In this hypothetical cartoon, genetic drift affects the genetic makeup of the population. But unlike natural selection, through an entirely random process, so although genetic drift is a mechanism of evolution, it doesn't work to produce adaptations. When we are talking about genetic drift, we need to talk about sampling error and evolution. Genetic drift is one of the basic mechanisms of evolution. It is simply the evolutionary equivalent of a sampling error. Imagine a game in which you have a bag holding 100 marbles, 50 of which are brown and 50 are green. You are allowed to draw out 10 marbles from the bag. Now imagine that the bag is restocked with 100 marbles with the same proportion of brown and green marbles as you have just drawn out. The game may play out something like this. Our starting population is 50 brown and 50 green. And you draw out 6 brown and 4 green. So our next generation, we're going to start with the same proportions. But we're going to get back to 100. So in that case, we end up with 60 brown and 40 green. Generation number 3, you randomly draw out a bunch more marbles. There's no reason for the colors that you draw, just randomness. In generation number 4, we are getting back to, in this instance, based on the random draw, 40 brown and 60 green. So you'll notice as we go through each generation, there's a slight adjustment that happens in the total number of marbles that are in the population. That might benefit the green marbles, it might benefit the brown marbles, and it might just simply go back and forth between green and brown marbles. It is clear that the ratio of brown to green marbles drifts around. Our first generation, we had a ratio of 5 to 5. The next one, 6 to 4. Then 7 to 3. Then 4 to 6. This drifting happens in populations of organisms. Due to many random factors, the genes in one generation do not wind up in identical ratios in the next generation. And this is evolution. It is possible for the frequency of genes for brown coloration to increase in a population of beetles without the help of natural selection. While this is evolution, it is evolution due to chance, not selection. Genetic drift has a number of factors that are important on the effects of evolution. Number 1, drift reduces genetic variation in a population, potentially reducing a population's ability to evolve in response to new selective pressures. Number 2, genetic drift acts faster and has more drastic results in smaller populations. This effect is particularly important in rare and endangered species. If we have a small population of rare or endangered species, the gene pool is what? It's very small. If the gene pool is smaller, then we end up with a population with fewer genes, right? Genetic drift can contribute to speciation. For example, a small isolated population may diverge from the larger population through genetic drift. So this idea is that if we have an isolated population that separates from the original population, it maybe ends up migrating to a new location, and you've got a few individuals in the population that are living there. The gene pool just became very small in that location with that new isolated population. But generation after generation after generation, you may end up with individuals that are produced that, because there was a small gene pool, over many generations they become very different from the original population. That's the idea of speciation. A completely separate species kind of arrives because over long periods of time, the isolated population becomes very different from the original population. Effects of genetic drift. Through sampling error, genetic drift can cause populations to lose genetic variation, thereby decreasing variation. Imagine that our random draws from the marble bag produced the following patterns. We started out with 5 to 5, and then a ratio of 6 to 4, and then 7 to 3, and then 4 to 6, and then 8 to 2, and then we end up with 10 to 0, 10 to 0, 10 to 0, 10 to 0. So why did we keep drawing 10 to 0? It's because the green marbles fail to be represented in just one draw. We can't get them back. We are stuck with only the brown marbles. The cartoon that we are seeing here represents or illustrates the process beginning with the fourth draw from before. So we go into draw number 4, and we've got a 60 to 40 population, and then we draw out 8 that are brown and 2 that are green, causing our population to end up being more brown. And then the next generation, well, we draw out all browns and we draw out 0 greens. And so we've completely eliminated that gene from the gene pool. We've created a situation where we can't have the green marbles anymore. The same thing can happen in populations. If the gene for green coloration drifts out of the population, the gene is gone for good, unless, of course, there's a mutation or gene flow reintroduces the green gene. The simulation that we just observed illustrates one of the most important effects of genetic drift. It reduces the amount of genetic variation in a population. And with less genetic variation, there is less for natural selection to work with. If the green gene drifts out of the population and the population ends up in a situation where it would be advantageous to be green, the population is out of luck. Selection cannot increase the frequency of the green gene because it's not there for selection to act on. Selection can only act on what variation is already in the population. It cannot create variation. So the impact on a small population with regard to this genetic drift is usually really high. If you end up with a really small isolated population, we know that we don't have as many genes in a small population as what we would in a very large population. So the marble drawing scenario also illustrates why genetic drift affects small populations more. Imagine that your bag was only big enough for 20 marbles, so it's a really small bag. And that you can only draw 4 marbles out to represent gene frequencies in the next generation. Something like this cartoon might play out, where we end up with 10 to 10 for a total of 20, and you draw out 1 brown and 3 greens. And then the next generation, you have a higher frequency of greens, so you end up drawing out 15 that are green and only 5 that are brown. And then the next generation after that, you've only drawn out greens. And so very quickly and drastically, the marble ratio changes from 1:1 to 1:3 to 0:1. The same process operates in small populations. All populations experience drift, but the smaller the population is, the sooner drift will have a drastic effect. This may be a big problem for endangered species that have low population sizes. Your task, I'm going to assign you to a group, and your group is going to whiteboard these 3 questions. How is genetic drift similar to natural selection? In what ways does genetic drift differ from natural selection? And why does genetic drift make it harder for natural selection to work?